present to turn off any mobile phones, tablets or other electronic devices. The first item on our agenda is to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth on the Budget Scotland Act 2012 Amendment Order 2013. This draft order is subject to affirmative procedure. This means that the Parliament must approve the order before it can be made and come into force. We have a motion in the name of the Cabinet Secretary inviting the committee to recommend to the Parliament that the draft instrument be approved. Before we come to the debate on the motion under Agenda Item 2, we will hold an evidence session to clarify any technical matters or to allow explanation of detail. The Cabinet Secretary is accompanied from the Scottish Government Finance Directorate by Janet Edgedell and Terry Holmes. Good morning all, and I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. The Spring Budget Revision provides the last opportunity to amend the Scottish Budget for 2012-13. It deals with 4 types of amendments to the budget. Firstly, changes of substance, where we are proposing to increase the money devoted to particular areas of spend. Secondly, a number of technical adjustments that have no impact on spending power. Thirdly, a small number of Whitehall transfers. And finally, some cash-neutral transfers of resources between portfolio budgets. The net impact on all of these changes is an increase in the approved budget of approximately £451 million, from £33,739 million to £34,190 million. Table 1.2 on page 6 of the supporting document shows the approved budget following the autumn budget revision and the changes sought in the spring budget revision. There is the deployment of £51.3 million of funding from available Barnett consequentials flowing from the UK autumn budget statement in December 2012, HM Treasury transfers and the utilisation of budget exchange flexibilities. As part of my announcement to the Parliament on the 19th of December 2012, I confirmed that a further £25.2 million of capital budget would be allocated for 2012-13 at the spring budget revision. The revised budget therefore reflects funding for transport initiatives, economic development and regeneration projects, culture and heritage projects, rural environment and tourism projects, support for the maintenance and improvements of the Scottish Court Estate and local government. In addition, there is £16 million funding allocation to health and wellbeing. This will be managed by the portfolio within existing resources to support Commonwealth Games and Olympic legacy initiatives in 2012-13 over the next 2 years. I have provided budgets of £5.6 million to support investment in essential equipment at the Scottish Crime Campus and other net budget cover amounting to £4.5 million. The second set of changes comprise a number of technical adjustments to the budget. The technical adjustments are non-cash and budget neutral. However, it is necessary to reflect these adjustments to ensure the budget is consistent with the final outturn reported in our annual accounts. The main technical adjustments in this revision include £187.5 million of additional annually managed expenditure budget for non-cash provisions, impairments and depreciation to align the budget for accounting purposes. £41.3 million non-cash cover to align the International Financial Reporting Standards-based budgets for PPP PFI schemes for year-end accounting purposes. £192 million for the impairment of student loan balances on income contingent repayment loans. Non-cash budget of £58.3 million to cover forecast increased depreciation on the road network. And a non-cash net technical reduction of £80 million in respect of the Scottish Teachers and NHS pension schemes arising from a number of actuarial assessed factors. With regard to Whitehall transfers, 3 are recorded in the spring budget revision, resulting in a net impact of negative £0.7 million on the approved budget. The final part of the budget revision concerns the transfer of funds between portfolios to align the budgets with profiled spend. There are a number of internal transfers within the budget as part of the revision process. These have no impact on spending power. The main transfers between portfolios include a transfer of £18 million from education to local government for the Orkney and Western Isles School programme, a transfer of £10 million from culture to external affairs to education for people and infrastructure, a transfer of £8 million of existing budget provision from other portfolios to infrastructure, investment in cities, and parliamentary business and government strategy to ensure the efficiency delivered in respect of public information and social advertising campaigns and the international marketing and promotion of Scotland. A transfer of £5.9 million from rural affairs and the environment to local government to deliver rural broadband, and a transfer of £5 million from Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth to local government for the decoupling exercise in respect of Scottish Parliament and local elections timing. As in previous years, there are also a number of minor internal portfolio transfers which have no effect on portfolio totals, but ensure that individual internal budgets are monitored effectively. The committee will wish to note that as part of our internal monitoring process and in line with good practice, we have taken the opportunity at the spring budget revision to deploy emerging underspends within the Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth and Infrastructure Investment in Cities portfolios to ensure that we maximise the budget available in 2012-13, in particular where possible to ensure capital investment. The SBR records the deployment of £30.9 million of redirected budget, representing 0.1% of the DEL budget. The spring budget revision also reflects the proposed transfer of budget from resource to capital in respect of the Scottish budget, noting that the Scottish budget records capital that scores in the Scottish Government's consolidated accounts or the accounts of our directly funded bodies. In the context of our Her Majesty's Treasury budget, the planned resource to capital transfer is £227.6 million. This switching is managed within the total DEL available to the Scottish Government. The increase of £21 million on the figure provided in December 2012 as part of the response to the Finance Committee report on the draft budget reflects the outcome of the internal monitoring exercise in January 2013. It is my proposal to write to the Finance Committee once we have provisional outturn figures in June with a table setting out the actual transfers by portfolio and programme in a similar format to the table we provided in response to the Committee's report on the draft budget. As we approach the final year end, we will continue in line with our normal practice to monitor forecast outturn against budget, and wherever possible, we will seek to utilise emerging underspends to ensure we maximise use of the resources available to us in 2012-13 and to proactively manage the flexibility under the budget exchange mechanism agreed between the Treasury and the devolved administrations. I confirm in line with previous years that it is my intention to make a statement to Parliament prior to the summer recess on provisional outturn in respect of both our Scottish Parliament budget and Her Majesty's Treasury budget. The brief guide to the spring budget revision prepared by my officials sets out the background and the details of the main changes that are proposed. I hope that the committee found the guide helpful, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions arising.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive statement. I'm sure there are a few questions around the table, although some of the ones I had planned to ask have actually been answered in your introduction. Just wondering though, if you talked initially about the 51.3 million arising from Barnett consequentials, HM Treasury transfers and the utilisation of budget exchange flexibilities. I'm just wondering if you can give us a wee bit more information on how that's actually split between the Barnett consequentials, Treasury transfers and use of the BEM.
The Barnett consequentials arising out of the autumn statement totalled £4.6 million, convener, and the budget exchange flexibilities totalled £46.7 million. Within that £46.7 million is a one-off transfer in respect of Olympic legacy funding, which arose out of the issues that the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations raised with the UK Government about the calculation of Barnett consequentials arising out of Olympics expenditure, where essentially there was a disagreement with the previous United Kingdom Government, which was sustained into the new Government, about the treatment of essentially regeneration expenditure in the East End of London, which ordinarily regeneration expenditure in the East End of London would have attracted Barnett consequentials. The previous UK Government took a view that this was an Olympic project, so the Olympics were a pan-UK project, there was no Barnett consequentials arising. We, along with our Welsh and Northern Ireland colleagues, disputed that. That was an issue which the current UK Government agreed to try to address, and we came to an agreement which resulted in a one-off transfer of £16 million of legacy funding, which is now being deployed.
Okay, thank you very much for that point of clarification. You talked towards the end of your statement about the resource to capital transfer of 227.6 million, which, as you indicated, is more than the 207 million previously indicated. I'm just wondering if you can expand a wee bit on how this switch has been achieved and what particular capital projects will benefit from this transfer.
In terms of the all of the transfers are happening within portfolio conveners, so there's no, for example, health to enterprise portfolio change of that nature. It's all health to health, enterprise to enterprise, so it's all undertaken within the individual portfolios. In terms of the pattern of that expenditure, if I just the crucial table in front of me, it's following largely the plan that we set out previously, convener, although there are differences between some of the areas of performance. For example, on health and well-being, we'd set out an expectation of £95 million of a resource to capital transfer. We expect that to be about 87 million because in the nature of how we are essentially the health shift is to support more maintenance projects. When you begin to explore the categorisation of what constitutes capital and resource expenditure, some of the maintenance activity ends up being classified, although it's been done as self-maintenance, it may well be classified as as resource expenditure. So at the margins of that type of analysis, we see in the latest assessment that we're making some changes in the composition, but the overall picture is that we are moving to a total of £227.6 million. In relation to the areas covered, some, for example, are about taking forward individual capital projects within the enterprise network. As I said, the health maintenance proposition. In rural affairs, we are undertaking some projects to strengthen the forest estate, to put forward capital grants for the rollout of superfast broadband, and work to strengthen the agricultural estate. So there's a range of different propositions within those areas.
Okay, and just one final question before I open it out to colleagues. Again, in your opening statement, you talked about annually managed expenditure as agreed with HM Treasury to cover provisions and impairments of £187.5 million. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a wee bit more about what this means in practical terms.
Well, essentially, a calculation is undertaken several times during the year on different aspects of the government's budget and how what essentially accounting provision has to be made for some of the expenditure that we undertake. So the annual managed expenditure is not a budget that we control. It's essentially an area of activity that we negotiate with the UK government. For example, within that total, there will be £39.5 million of provision allocated to NHS boards, which arises out of their assessment of some of the financial implications of or potential financial implications of injury benefits, other assessments in other portfolios about the accounting treatment of the motorway infrastructure, for example. £73.4 million will be allocated to the infrastructure portfolio in relation to the accounting provisions for land compensation payments in respect of road schemes. There will be impairments in the Scottish Prison Service around the valuation of their estate and properties. Again, within the health boards, there will be there's an assessment being undertaken of the depreciation required to be applied to donated assets across health boards. So essentially, there are a range of accounting transactions as a consequence of this exercise.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open out the session to colleagues, and the first person to ask a question will be Michael, to be followed by Gavin.
Thanks, Convener. There's a lot of tables, as you know, Cabinet Secretary, and a lot of the figures are quite clear in terms of money transferring between them, but very often not an explanation as to what the transfer actually means in reality. And one example of that is an £80 million reduction for the Scottish teachers and NHS pension schemes to reflect changes in actuarial forecasts. So could you give us an explanation as to what that will actually mean behind the figures?
Well, essentially, what has happened here is that there is periodically an actuarial assessment will be made of the teachers' pension scheme. On this occasion, there was an actuarial recalculation of the closing liability on the scheme at the 31st of March 2012, and that actuarial calculation was by no means insignificant. It went from 23.6 billion to 22.4 billion. Now, as a consequence of that, there is then a calculation made about the interest that is required to be calculated on that, substantially smaller sum than the original estimate, and the interest recalculation was 59.9 million. There were then, as a consequence again of that valuation, a reduction in current service costs of 39.3 million. Those numbers were netted off by a reduction in the capitalisation receipts within the pension scheme, and which again requires non-cash budget cover, which netted off at £87.1 million. So essentially what drove the issue was an actuarial revaluation of the scheme, which resulted in a not insignificant change in the overall position of the pension scheme.
Can I ask you, is that common, that scale of transfer, and in terms of the document you produced yourself about projecting forward in terms of pension liabilities, is that the type of fluctuation that you envisage from one year to the next?
I have to say I find that particular actuarial recalculation to be at the very significant end of the spectrum. Very significant end. It's not far from common, and I think if I couldn't give the committee a range of factors, but a difference of £1.2 billion in my estimations is at the very, very significant end of the spectrum.
Okay, that's within the document as well, there's figures like a transfer of £10 million from culture and external affairs to education for people and infrastructure. But again, the documentation doesn't exactly specify what people and infrastructure is. Can you clarify what that transfer entails?
Essentially, the particular transfer was to deal with underspends in the cultural and external affairs portfolio, which then assisted us in supporting the development of the schools programme. So it's essentially a direct transfer to assist us in funding some elements of these programmes.
And another one, fairly substantial figure when you consider what it's been spent on, but a transfer of £8 million into infrastructure investment in cities from other portfolios, though it doesn't say what other portfolios have lost out to find that £8 million, but it's for social advertising campaigns. Can you tell us what those campaigns were?
What I can do, Mr. McMahon, what we do is we essentially centrally manage the social advertising activity of the government across a range of different advertising campaigns. And the reason why, essentially, individual portfolios have to identify and agree with myself and the Deputy First Minister the composition of their advertising programmes to put some central control on how much advertising spend the government as a whole undertakes. And they have to provide the money for that. And essentially, once we reach agreement about what will be the composition of the advertising programme, we then take the money from individual portfolios, put it into the infrastructure portfolio budget, and it's disbursed at that level. The committee may recall that in 2010-11 I established a cap on advertising expenditure at 50% of the previous total at £6.695 million. And that cap has been sustained. We are undertaking advertising expenditure of 6.108 million within that cap. And then there is additional provision which is outside that advertising cap on international marketing of 1.532 million. Now, to give the committee a flavour of the campaigns that were supported within that cap, there was £800,000 for road safety, 800,000 for Detect Cancer Early, 600,000 for the contribution to food waste, 600,000 for essentially the Greener Over campaign, which is about climate change related matters, £500,000 on awareness on organ donation, 400,000 on alcohol behaviour change, 300,000 on Home Energy Scotland, 300,000 on active travel, smoking cessation of 300,000, 300,000 on the Take Life On national marketing campaign, 300,000 on early years marketing, 200,000 on seasonal flu, 200,000 on No Knives Better Lives, 200,000 on fuel poverty, and 200,000 for Ready for Winter. So it's the pretty staple diet of public information advertising that the government undertakes.
But from the figures, it looks as though it's gone into infrastructure away from those types of health and justice related campaigns. Is that not the case?
What really this arises from is when Mr Crawford left the government, we took his. He previously had responsibility for the management of that of that process. I had to sign off the overall financial cap. He negotiated much of the detail of the advertising campaigns. When Mr Crawford left the government and his portfolio in relation to government strategy was assumed by the Deputy First Minister, we simply shifted that budget line because it's at £8 million, it's a relatively small budget line at this level of expenditure, and that was applied into the Deputy First Minister's portfolio responsibilities.
Actually, a transfer of like health advertising to the infrastructure.
No, it's simply
for responsibility.
That's absolutely. It's essentially a way of grouping. In our estimation, as transparently as we possibly can do, but I'm not sure we've succeeded in that effort by the exchange we've just had. But essentially, to group it all together, have it in one budget line, so that can be observed and it appears in the infrastructure portfolio, because that's the area where of the Deputy First Minister's portfolio, and she assumed the responsibilities for government strategy that Mr Crawford had previously held.
Thanks.
Okay, Gavin, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, can I refer you to page 15 of the spring budget revision? The lower table on that page has the line energy, which would appear to be a total of £42 million.
Sorry, I'm on the.
This document.
No, just bear with me a second.
15.
Right, okay. Right,
The energy line appears to be £42 million. Now, if I read the budget correctly, the original figure was £64 million, and then at the autumn budget revision it went up to £75.3 million, and it's obviously gone down to 42. Are you in a position to explain what has happened to the energy budget over the course of the year, but particularly particularly since the autumn budget revision took place?
Essentially, what there are a number of factors that are relevant here. The first is we expected to be spending about £16 million of the Renewable Energy Infrastructure Fund, the Renewable Energy Investment Fund, on supporting renewables projects. As I have indicated, and as I indicated to Parliament during the final stages of the budget bill in for 2013-14, we are finding that the uptake of these funds is slower than we anticipated. So we had made provision for it. At the time of setting the autumn budget, the information I had gave me confidence that would be deployed in this financial year. As the year has gone forward, I am less confident about that, and what I am taking action to address is the fact that I may end up with unspent resources that, as Mr Brown will be familiar, I have to watch that unspent resources can be properly carried forward if they can be. So I've made the judgment that this resource will not be required in this financial year. And certainly the caveat, however, that because this fund has been created by the fossil fuel levy resources, that has to be made good over the duration of the forward period. So the £103 million that was that was allocated through the fossil fuel levy, we have to demonstrate that has been spent over the course of a number of years on renewable energy projects, and obviously I reaffirm that commitment today. The other major item is that in the community and renewable energy scheme and in some of the microgeneration renewables schemes, there has been a lower uptake of the budgeted provision that we had available, and in this respect, the government is redeploying resources to ensure that we don't lose these resources in due course.
So if I heard that right, but £16 million approximately is down to renewables projects.
But to be absolutely precise, 13.6. Okay. Out of, it was originally 16. I now forecast 2.4 million to be expended in that way. 13.6 on Renewables Energy Investment Fund. 8.6 million from a number of smaller energy projects, which are really spread across 3 areas: community and renewable energy, microgeneration renewables, and the prototyping of offshore wind energy renewables activity. And finally, about £2.3 million that related to some other projects within the low carbon economy.
That's still, if it was 75 at the autumn budget review, or 75.3 at the autumn budget review, and it's 42 now, that explanation gives me some of it. Are you, if not now, are you able to tell us what the remainder is made up of?
Well, the remainder,
about 25. I think there's a gap of about
it was 23.8 is what's arising out of there. The reconciliation to 75, I don't have the autumn budget revision level in front of me just now, but I'm happy to provide the clarity that it fills in the remaining, it must be about £8 million.
Okay. Thank you. Can we go over the page on the spring budget revision to page 16, which is the third sector section. The original budget for the third sector was 24.5 million. It ends up at 18.4 million, which, you know, is the best part of a quarter. 1 million of that appears to go to a Justice Change Fund, so presumably one could argue that that's third sector in some guise.
That was always the plan, that when we set the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund, part of the financial underpinning of that was the transfer of £1 million from the third sector budget to the justice portfolio for that purpose.
Sure. That would make sense. In terms of the other reduction, though, I mean, there's a reduction of the best part of 5 million, yeah, out of what's notionally called the third sector budget. Are you able to explain that? Has that money gone to the third sector in some other way, or has Have they lost it effectively?
Well, essentially, what has happened here is that we ran a programme in the previous financial years in relation to the Enterprise Growth Fund for principally for social enterprises. It was a very successful fund, and the government committed to taking that forward. As we have gone through that exercise, there has been a range of consultation about how best to focus and target that fund in future years. That discussion and dialogue and the procurement process has gone on for longer than we had originally estimated. So those resources will be unable to be spent during this financial year, but the Enterprise Growth Fund will be launched very shortly. But the expenditure will not arise in this financial year. So essentially this is part of my assessment of where programmes have not been able to match the level of performance that we would have expected. So we therefore redeploy those resources to other purposes.
I wonder if you can explain to me, Cabinet Secretary, page 52 of the Spring Budget Revision, which is known as the Young Scots Fund. It was originally getting 5.4 million. There appeared to be a reduction of 2.4 million in the autumn budget revision. There's a reduction of 2 million in this revision, which leaves the Young Scots Fund with $1 million instead of 5.4 million. Can you just explain what has happened there?
The issue there is, if I just get the essentially this is a timing factor, that some of the propositions that we would have expected to have been funded under this line have not materialised at this stage, but the funding that we have allocated for that, but the commitment that we have given, will be made good in future financial years.
So I suppose the last area I wanted to ask about, the convener has asked a little about already, the revenue to capital switch, which you referred to in your opening statement. So I know that you're going to send us a table showing us where the switches have happened. I think you said in June in your opening statement. Is that?
When we're in a firmer position about the outturn, obviously, as the committee will appreciate, there is a process of, even once we reach financial outturn, there's still a process of assessment and validation of the approach that we've taken, which can deliver some change, but I would think sometime after outturn would be the desirable point.
It seems to me to be two big changes. One is that the enterprise agencies seem to switch a lot less to capital than was originally envisaged, substantially less. Can you explain just the background to that and why the enterprise agencies didn't, in this financial year, switch as much from revenue to capital?
Well, essentially, there's a number of things will interact together here. There will be changes to budget allocations arising out of the decisions that I've taken when we've acquired new capital resources. They will have been deployed, so there will be an element to which we will take decisions to deploy those resources, and that can have an effect on the capital programmes of enterprise bodies and others. Secondly, there is an interaction with capital receipts. Capital receipts are, an assessment is made of where the likely capital receipts are going to come from. They may overshoot, they may undershoot, and that will have an effect on how those resources can be utilised in due course. And then there is the interaction with particular programmes and projects, some of which will be responsive to demand within the marketplace. We may have particular projects that we think at the time of planning are likely to come forward and to be realised, essentially working with individual companies to shadow their investment plans. If companies change their investment plans, then we cannot deploy our part of the bargain. And So there's quite there are quite a number of factors that will play together in that situation. So what we predict at the outset of a financial year is designed to be as accurate and realistic an approach as we possibly can do, but it will vary by a number of factors, whether it's capital receipts, additional capital consequentials that become available, or the change of plans by individual companies with which we may be, or other organisations with which we may be in partnership.
Just a brief follow-up on the first two. The third one, I understand companies' plans change. In relation to capital receipts, did the enterprise agencies collect more in capital receipts than they anticipated at the start of the year, or did they collect less than they anticipated? I mean, you said they can overshoot or undershoot. They can only do one, obviously.
They collected more in capital receipts that were anticipated. I took a fairly pessimistic view of capital receipts when we formulated the budget, given the property market, and I don't think that was a particularly unreasonable assumption to make. But the capital receipts have actually been more significant than we'd planned.
So Scottish Enterprise collected more in capital receipts than you thought they would at the start of the year?
They did, yes.
But by a large margin. I mean, do you have figures?
I don't have the numbers to hand, but I can certainly provide you with
okay,
details.
I'm grateful. And just then, if I follow up on the very first one, there are changes to budget allocations, I think you said. If I interpret that correctly, does that mean if there's additional capital given through Barnett consequentials or any other way, you're saying Scottish Enterprise might get a slice of that, and therefore they don't transfer some of the revenue to capital they were intending to? Is that what you meant?
That could be the situation, yes.
Okay.
Malcolm, to be followed by John.
I was going to ask about resource to capital as well, which you've covered quite a lot, but if I could just really go back to some of the top line figures, because basically the switch is now 20 million more than you suggested in your response to our report, and you've also explained this morning that the reduction of 8 million in health and wellbeing is more apparent than real, because you argued it was just doing the same work but classified as resource. And in response to Gavin Brown just now, you've indicated that the minus 5 million to finance and sustainable growth doesn't really represent a reduction in overall capital expenditure either. So I just wondered, in fact, whether, I mean, I'm not criticising this decision, but I just wonder how you come to decisions about how much resource to capital to have, and it does appear that you've decided to put quite a lot more into resource to capital transfers than you originally planned. Would that be true? And what would you base such decisions on?
Well, essentially, what we have encouraged different elements of government, essentially responding to the strategic economic direction of the government to support greater capital investment. And Mr. Chisholm, the committee, will be entirely familiar with the government's concerns over the reduction in capital expenditure since 2010. So our direction of policy has been to encourage and to maximise capital investment wherever we can, and different parts of the organisation are essentially responding to that challenge as effectively as they can do in that process. And obviously, you know, Cabinet is leading that process in identifying ways in which we can do so. So the government will make a judgment about the overall allocation of its resources to judge how we can support some of the operational aspects of public services and public spending, and how much of that we can transfer to capital to supplement the resources. And you know, what we've arrived at here is a position where the overall total we expect to be about 227 million compared to the original plan of 206 for this financial year.
I mean, do you do any kind of economic analysis of, you know, the consequences of switching, of losing resource, or do you just say, well, how much can resource budgets endure? Because obviously there's a lot of difficulties there just because of the general financial situation, or can you make an economic assessment that at a certain point actually it's going to have negative economic consequences to shift too much from resource into capital? I mean,
I think there is a judgment to be made there, as to, and that was my point really about the sustainability of resource budgets. Part of our economic analysis here is driven by material which I've shared with the committee before, which is the analysis undertaken by the Office for Budget Responsibility that indicates that their view that £1 of capital delivers £1 of economic impact, £1 of resource delivers 0.6% of economic, 60 pence of economic impact. So there's a comparative, there's an economic analysis that underpins that expenditure. Having said that, that's what, you could take that to its logical conclusion and say, well, we'll spend it all in capital next, but that clearly doesn't make sense, because there are operational programmes that have to be supported, and essentially portfolios are making the judgment about how that can best be undertaken, and in the mix between resource and capital expenditure.
is that Office of Budget Responsibility, does that have any time frame attached to it? I mean, again, I'm not being critical, obviously I support more capital expenditure, but is there a kind more of a time lag for the economic effects of capital expenditure than resource? Or
No, because obviously, as we know from different types of capital expenditure will have, or different models of capital expenditure will have more impact. Direct capital expenditure that we can offer begins to have that effect on the economy very immediately and very directly.
I mean, in terms of the 51.3 million, I mean, how much of that came as capital and how much of that came as resource? I wasn't, looks as if a lot of it's capital, but not all of it.
I don't know if I have in front of me the split between the two, but I think if I okay. I think it'd probably be safe to say about 50% of it is applied as capital, and the lion's share of the remainder, for example, the 16 million on the lion's share of the remainder, 16 million is in funding for Commonwealth Games Olympic Legacy, which is resource expenditure. But I think it'd be safe to say about 50% of it was deployed as capital expenditure.
And how much of that came as part of the budget exchange flexibilities? Was that
about 46.7 million came as budget exchange flexibility.
So that means in practice most of that money is actually will be spent in future years, or next year, or not particularly next year, or does that mean most of it will be spent in?
Well, the 51.3 will be spent within this current financial year.
How much?
The 51.3 will be spent within the 12-13 financial year.
How does that work then for the Commonwealth Games funding?
Oh, sorry. Well, it's allocated to the budget holders, and then it will be deployed as part of their ongoing commitments over several years on that particular provision.
So that's all part of the carry forward. You're allowed to carry forward, is it 0.6 of resource DEL and up to 1.5% of capital DEL?
That's correct.
Are you kind of near those ceilings, or are you got?
Well, essentially it's an annual calculation, so there's no inbuilt historic. I think if Mr. Chisholm will be familiar from the period that existed before the 2010 change of government, it was possible to accumulate a surplus in the Treasury and then draw that down. That was abolished in 2010 and replaced by a system which gave us the ability to carry forward 0.6% of resource, 1.5% of capital, but on an annual basis, so there's no cumulative sum of money. So the allocation for carry forward from 12-13 to 13-14 is about 150 million in resource and about 40 million in capital, so 190 million in total. Now, I would imagine that the budget for 2013-14 is underpinned by over £100 million of carryover, so we will have to carry over a certain amount, and we're on course to do so. I'm obviously trying to minimise the amount of capital carryover.
Yes, that's not very much capital. I was quite surprised by that, because, I mean, just last question, I mean, given the several additional tranches that you've allocated to housing this year, does that mean that you're spending all of that this year?
Yes.
But you're also spending for
Well,
housing now?
the announcements I've made, I think one of the comments I would have made to Parliament in the February budget statement was that there was £200 million of resources allocated to housing in the last 12 months, if I remember my phraseology correct. Not all of that would have been deployed within this financial year. Some of it will be deployed in 13-14 as a consequence of Barnett consequentials that will have arisen to be deployed in that financial year.
Okay, thanks, that's fine.
Okay, John, to be followed by Jamie.
Thanks, Convener. It was really just one point under your technical adjustments. There's 192 million mentioned for impairment of student loan balances. And I was just kind of wondering if you could maybe give us a little explanation about what that means.
Essentially, that summarises from a revaluation of the student loan book, and the value of the student loan book is calculated using a particular model called the HERO model, and it's compared, the valuation arising out of that is compared with the existing of the valuation of the loan book, and a decision is taken on whether any variation is sufficiently material to require the carry forward value to be adjusted. The comparison for 12-13 gives a difference of 6% in the carry forward of loans with the actual position, which is significant enough to require that adjustment. The variation has essentially been driven by material changes in the rate of inflation over recent years, and in agreement with the Treasury and Treasury Protocol, £192 million of budget cover has been provided for that purpose.
Right, so effectively that's something that comes from Westminster and doesn't affect our actual budget, as I understand.
That's correct, yes, sir.
Yes. And is that to do with the fact that students will not be earning and won't be able to repay their loans?
I think it's essentially driven by a difference in the rate of inflation that will be calculated within the loan book, and therefore the consequent value that will be realised as a consequence of that factor. And it simply creates a need for more provision within the budget to meet the notional cost of that to the public purse, which is what the AME calculation is about.
Thank you.
Okay, Jamie, to be followed by Jean.
Convener, Cabinet Secretary, in the Financial Scrutiny Unit paper that we've been given, it refers to page 37 of the Spring Budget revision, and it says the proceeds of criminal acts receipts, which are £15.1 million, do not balance with proceeds of criminal acts payments, £10.8 million. But it seems pretty clear to me, and I just wonder if you could confirm this, that this is because those receipts are utilised in a range of interventions. They become retained income in the box and bottom, and clearly they're directed to community safety and drug misuse as well as the proceeds of crime scheme. Is that correct?
Yeah. What essentially happens here is that there are the Justice Portfolio surrenders the £15.1 million from the proceeds of crime acts to the Scottish Consolidated Fund, and then it largely gets back 10.8 million of that for a variety of different programmes to support young people and divert them from crime and antisocial behaviour. There is then a range of other expenditure totalling £4.3 million, which was transferred to other programmes. £1.7 million went to Community Justice Services for payback grant schemes for offenders renovating sports facilities. 200,000 to Community Justice Services for mentoring projects. 800,000 went to Police Division for the recruitment of additional financial investigators, which is obviously kind of handy for boosting the proceeds of crime resources. 0.2 million went to the Crown Office, and 0.2 million went to Creative Scotland, and 0.6 to international development.
It's all obviously directed at trying to intervene and stop
Correct,
people
yes.
engaging in criminal activity. Am I correct in recalling that there is a Treasury cap on the amount of criminal proceeds of criminal act monies that can be raised? Is that correct, or have I picked that up wrongly?
I think we'll come back to give chapter and verse to the committee on this point. I think my recollection is that we are able to retain only a proportion of these proceeds, but I think for the sake of absolute clarity, I better confirm that in writing to the committee.
So you think that's correct, but you'll come back to us. I mean, can I ask then, do we, I mean, clearly, I suppose this is a sort of strange area in that, you know, ideally would want there to be no proceeds of criminal acts money because there'd be less criminal activity, but, you know, we've got the scheme and I don't know if there's some sort of forecast in terms of revenue to bring in, or is it just you wait and see what comes in?
However, we can form what I would say is a firmer expectation of what is likely to come in, given the caseload that the Crown Office is dealing with and the expectation of success the Crown Office would have in making individual prosecutions. And the Crown Office has been more successful in identifying the areas where there is quite clearly an exposure to proceeds of crime, and how those resources can be realised for the benefit of the public purse.
I mean, I suppose this answer might be contingent on whether or not there is a cap, as you'll come back to confirm, but in terms of the receipts that are, let's say, £15.1 million, is that more or less than was expected?
That will be, I think, one of the highest figures that we have had in proceeds of crime resources.
That's helpful, thank you. Okay, Jean.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, on page 24 of the revised budget, there's an amount of 18 million transfer to local government in relation to schools programme, and there's 2 schools identified in Orkney and the Western Isles. I'm just trying to understand how that works, because am I right in thinking that there's a budget of about 40 million, which is Scottish Government Schools Building Programme money, to which local governments every year are invited to bid, really, for new school building. And that, again, I understand works on the principle that local government will have some money for a particular school building, and government approving that will then potentially support it with Scottish Government money. If we transfer from education to local government, does that change the dynamic of school building programmes?
This is a particularly unique issue, this particular budget line, which is really what I suppose I could only best describe as a hangover of the approaches to the PFI programmes that the government inherited, where, because of the nature of the island communities that were involved, some of the PFI schemes were very difficult to make happen. They were schemes that were committed, but they were difficult to make happen. The government had to meet some of the costs of essentially supporting the development of those programmes to ensure that the schools were able to be built. So this is not a general. I wouldn't read into this a particularly general approach about school building. This is something unique to the situation in Orkney and the Western Isles. In relation to school building will essentially be supported by two mainstream opportunities. One will be direct capital, where we provide capital grant to local authorities and they will make their own decisions about how to deploy that. And secondly, the NPD programme, which has taken its course. But this was a commitment the government gave to these authorities to ensure that these schools programmes could be continued. But I wouldn't read anything more into it than that.
Thank you, colleagues. We now move to the debate on the motion under agenda item 2, and I therefore invite the Cabinet Secretary formally to move the motion S4M 05868 that the Finance Committee recommends that the Budget Scotland Act 2012 Amendment Order 2013 be approved. First of all, do members have any further questions? They have indicated they do not. I now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S4M 05868 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. The committee will now communicate its decision formally to the Parliament by way of a short report which provides a link to the official report for this debate. Are members content with this approach? Yes. Thank you. I'll just allow a brief 2-minute suspension while the witnesses change over and we move to agenda item 3. Okay, the third item on our agenda today is to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth on the Committee's Improving Employability Report, which was published on the 3rd of December last year. The Cabinet Secretary is accompanied from the Scottish Government Employability and Skills Division by Julianne Bellotti and Martin McDermott. So welcome once again to the Cabinet Secretary and to his officials. And just to remind people that the inquiry's remit was, and I quote, to explore the need to improve the employability of individuals experiencing high levels of multiple deprivation as a prerequisite to increasing sustainable economic growth. And of course there was a plenary debate held on 8th of January this year. So I'd like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement.
I think on this occasion, Convener, I've given the committee a response in the chamber and also a written response, so I think I'll be very happy to answer questions based on those contributions.
Okay, thank you very much. And indeed, the Cabinet Secretary did actually write to me on the 18th of February, and of course colleagues will have copies of the very detailed responses to the questions that were put. But of course, when you respond to questions, that often generates further questions, and I'm sure that colleagues around the table will have plenty of those. I certainly have a few of my own. So in the usual fashion, I will start with some questions before opening the session out to colleagues around the table. And the first one really is with regard to your response in relation to the employment recruitment incentive, which is £1.5 million over 3 years. To support 1,000 disadvantaged young people, including care leavers, carers and ex-offenders, providing an incentive of £1,500 per individual to encourage employers to assist the transition of young people with a background as a care leaver, ex-young offender or young carer into sustainable employment and support them with the transition to sustainable employment. So I'm just wondering if you can explain to me how this is actually going to work. And in terms of the payment, is it going to be over a one-off payment for a 4-week or a 6-week support? Is it to provide ongoing support? I just wonder if you can provide some background to that.
The approach that will be proposed essentially what we will be doing will be working with employers to ensure that we put in place resources that enable them to sustain the recruitment, employment and training of individuals. So I would envisage that the payments will not be a one-off payment. They will be essentially dependent on performance as we proceed through the deployment of the initiative. We have to be absolutely assured that the initiative is delivering the outcome that we are seeking. So therefore, the funding has to be conditional on performance that is achieved as part of that exercise. Clearly, the Skills Development Scotland will be working very closely with individual companies to take this forward.
Okay, thank you very much. And I note that the £3 million has been allocated for the Third Sector Challenge Fund to provide additional pre-employment support to 1,754 young people. Now, it's a fairly rounded sum of money, £3 million, but it's a fairly precise number of young people. I'm just wondering how you came to that particular figure.
So that will be a calculation essentially of a per capita expectation of the cost of particular support within that £3 million budget, and that will simply have driven the calculation of the number of, well, actually the contract values £3,200,276, so it's slightly more. It's not quite as rounded as we've suggested in the statement. So, and it will be a calculation about the cost of the programme and therefore the number of individuals that can be assisted.
So when you're preparing these programmes, you're looking at how much is money you have available and then fit the number of young people into that programme, or are you looking at the number of young people you can help and then see what resources are available? How does it really work?
Well, essentially, it will be driven by a policy desire to take a particular course of action. In this occasion, it's to ensure that we have in place support that's particularly targeted towards the social enterprise and third sector communities. We will have a sum of money that gets allocated at that strategic level of the order of £3 million, and we will work out what is a reasonable cost for organisations to be reimbursed for taking on an individual in this particular initiative. Organisations will bid in to that fund, and once we see those bids, we will then make an assumption as to whether it's going to be on the button £3 million, or in this case £3,200,276, driven by the bids that we have had in from organisations.
And when you're looking to put together a fund like that, how do you assess potential demand for it? Because how do you know that the demand might not be for, say, 1,800 people as is indicated here, or it could be 5,000 people? How do you address that particular aspect?
I think I would have to concede, convener, that we will be, some of our judgments will be based on the resources that are available. So, if it's in the financial, when we are allocating resources from the very substantial numbers down into individual programmes, and we end up with the idea of having about £3 million for a fund of this type, I'm afraid that has to be the determinant of the test of affordability, and then we will try to maximise the effectiveness of that resource as we possibly can do. In terms of formulating what will be the relevant interventions for us to make, that's arrived at by a process of examining the current composition of the labour market, looking at particular challenges. And if we go back to the latter part of 2011, when the government recognised that we had a really very significant problem of youth unemployment that required specific action, the government deployed a set of different interventions to address that policy approach. We're now beginning to see a better position. Youth unemployment is still far too high, but it's not as high as it was in December 2011. So we're beginning to see the fruits of some of that activity to try to reduce the levels of youth unemployment.
I mean, in the evidence that we actually took a lot of concern over, you know, where responsibilities lay between the UK government, local government, and of course the Scottish government. I was really pleased to read of you chairing the very first meeting of the reconstituted Scottish Employability Forum on the 31st of January, and there'll be a rotating chair with, you know, with COSLA, Secretary of State for Scotland, and yourself. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a wee bit more about how you envisage that working in order to deliver this kind of joined up support for people requiring employability.
I think the first thing to say, Convener, is that the concern that you expressed about, and which the committee has expressed about the need for there to be consistency and complementarity between different approaches of different spheres of government, essentially is at the heart of why we have the Scottish Employability Forum, because I think the Secretary of State, myself and COSLA all accept that there is potential for overlap, duplication, lack of consistency in the way that the committee has expressed. So the Scottish Employability Forum is designed to be a response to that. The second point to make is that the first meeting of the forum heard really a pretty challenging presentation from Professor Alan McGregor, with whom many will be familiar, from the Training and Employment Research Unit of the University of Glasgow. And Professor McGregor leads a delivery group on behalf of the Employability Forum, which is tackling this particular issue. And Professor McGregor's presentation was as robust as any of us who have ever heard them before would judge him to be. And as a consequence of that, we agreed that the delivery group that Professor McGregor leads would go off and tackle particular areas of potential overlap and lack of consistency, and come back to the Employability Forum with a really strong mandate from us to tackle these issues and to make progress. So I think I got a very strong sense from that discussion that, notwithstanding the differences of responsibilities that exist between different parts of government, there is a joint willingness to tackle this particular question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We'll try and keep focused despite the kind of the voluminous responses from the young people next door, perhaps to, well, hope not to our deliberations. But just moving on to the Employability Fund, you know, and you've said, as previously noted, this will be open to all unemployed people of working age who have not yet been mandated to the work programme. I'm just wondering how many people are likely to be assisted by this and how it's going to work in practice.
The fund, we expect the fund will deliver in 2013-14 just over 17,000 individual training opportunities, which will be in excess of the commitment on modern apprenticeships of 25,000. The fund will, there will be a significant focus on young people, but we do recognise the need to support adults who've been unemployed for up to 12 months. There'll be a lot of joint working with the college sector in this respect, and the Employability Fund, the procurement process started back in December on behalf of Skills Development Scotland, so we'll be pursuing that in the course of the financial year to come.
Okay. Now, Paul Wheelhouse and Elaine Murray, who were members of the committee when we did a lot of this work, took a particular interest in the rural aspect of employability. And I noticed in the response there's talk of the Bus for Jobs scheme, and it says that this covers about 70% of all bus routes in Britain, and we understand this scheme could be extended if there's good feedback. I wonder if you can tell us a wee bit more about that, and kind of the 70% issue is what is the 30% that is excluded, if you like, and how is this going to work, this scheme, to help employability?
I think I think I'd have to come back to the committee with some response on the 30% aspect of it. I think that I don't think I could deal with that today, convener. In relation to the wider question of rural support, it is one of the issues that we touched on in the debate in January, and I think it's very important that we have in place an offering that is relevant to every part of the country. I was quite struck when I was in Fort William recently and in discussions with different local players in the field of employment and employability. And one of their points was that the demographic profile of that area, because of the availability of provisions such as the West Highland College in Fort William, and also the ability of many young people to, or the tendency of many young people to leave the locality to go to further and higher education opportunities out with that immediate labour market, despite the fact that the West Highland College is trying to reverse that trend, working with the University of the Highlands and Islands. There was a demographic profile in that locality that suggested more adults required support than was currently being provided. And I think that's part of our approach on the employability fund, is to recognise that we have to deal with, in different parts of the country, perhaps a different demographic profile about who actually requires support to gain access to employment, and that will be reflected in the rollout of the employability fund.
Okay, now evaluation was an issue that came up in the report, and you have some detail here on the strategic logic model, which will inform each evaluation of individual employment and skills initiatives. I'm just wondering, for the record, if you can, we do have some information on this obviously in your responses, but I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that a wee bit.
Well, essentially the strategic logic model is has been designed to take into account the guidance on evaluation of programmes, which has been produced by Her Majesty's Treasury. It essentially will explore at a project and programme level the effectiveness of the range of different interventions that we provide to support individuals into employment. The model essentially focuses on measuring progress towards the objectives that we set for Skills Development Scotland. It will explore the extent to which the approach that we take at a policy level supports the achievement of outcomes in the National Performance Framework, which of course the committee has taken a strong interest in. The approach will also be aiming to draw on a range of information sources that contest whether or not the approach and the model that we're taking forward is actually delivering the results that we could have expected, and will highlight any gaps in our knowledge and understanding of the marketplace as a consequence. So it's designed to look at the whole flow through from the setting of the National Performance Framework and what we want to achieve as a country, how that progresses into the design of the strategy for Skills Development Scotland and the whole area of employability, and how that translates into programme, and then work its way back through that to determine whether or not the programmes are actually fulfilling the strategic objectives of the government in that respect.
Okay, thank you. Now, in our evidence sessions, particularly workshops when we went to Dundee and Dumfries and Ardross, my own constituency, there were a lot of concerns that local authorities and the NHS weren't taking on their share, if you like, of apprentices and young people in other areas. And I noticed in terms of your response, you say that we've asked all Scottish Government public bodies to submit youth employment plans. We set out exactly what they will do in this regard. And on 23rd of January, the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, Derek Feely, wrote to each NHS Scotland board asking them to report by 28th of March on activity to improve employability during the current year and further activity in 2013-14. I'm just wondering if you will be able to provide the committee with details of that following the 28th of March, and also details of what local authorities are doing in this particular area also.
Certainly in relation to what is undertaken directly on the government's behalf and by public bodies at the government's behest, I'm delighted to provide that will be delighted to provide that to the committee. I think this message has been very strongly communicated by the Minister for Youth Employment, by the Permanent Secretary in the government, and by myself. And certainly report to the government, to the committee on that. On local authorities, I suspect I would possibly prefer if the committee sought that information from local government. I think that would be a more appropriate channel. Clearly local government, we discuss these priorities with local government, but I try to avoid a situation where I'm requiring local government to report to me on these things, but I think it's entirely legitimate for the committee to ask that question of local government.
Okay, just one final question before opening it out to colleagues. In terms of working for growth employers, you say are helping to inform the shape of the new employer recruitment incentive. And I mean, I did ask you initially about the one whereby 1.5 million provided for 1,000 disadvantaged people over 3 years. I'm just wondering if you have any further information you can convey to us on that issue of the recruitment incentive.
With the employer recruitment incentive, will support the creation of up to 10,000 job opportunities for young people in small businesses and medium-sized enterprises. We will be contributing £15 million in funding to that, £10 million coming from the European Social Fund, and it will provide a 50% wage subsidy over a 6-month period. The incentive is primarily aimed at helping young people aged between 16 and 24 who've been unemployed for up to 6 months, and very directly to try to help the small and medium-sized business sector to contribute towards economic recovery as a consequence of expanding their own staff team. So the work on that is far advanced. I would imagine that in the early part of the financial year there will be funding decisions taken in relation to particular commitments, and that's well underway to be deployed.
Okay, thank you. So open it up now to questions. The first person to ask questions will be Gavin.
Just to follow up to that final one, Convener, the employer recruitment incentive, I think in your paper here says it will go live in April. I mean, is that still the same time scale?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going from memory here, but I think in your initial budget speech back in September, there was going to be money from the Scottish Government, which was going to be match funded by European money. And I think what you described as business investment or contributions, I forget the exact wording.
The way I just expressed it to you, there'll be 50 million from the Scottish Government, 10 million from the European Social Fund for not quite matching, and that would offer a 50% wage subsidy for a 6-month period, and clearly the other 50% would have to come from the business. So it's essentially the government meeting, well, it's the public purse meeting 50% of the costs of an individual for 6 months.
Can I ask about another issue we looked at was funding of the third sector? Obviously, we discussed that in quite a bit of detail during the debate on this subject. I certainly saw a lot of evidence, and other committee members will have done too, from the third sector saying that they weren't getting 3-year funding as the norm, and in many cases it was still single-year funding, which is, I know, an issue that various political parties and governments have tried to do something about, including your own. In terms of what we do about it, the committee clearly made one suggestion. It's not necessarily the correct suggestion, but we made a suggestion, one which you're not indicating that you will take forward. But is there something additional that the government is minded to do in order to try and help this process?
Well, I think, as I've indicated to Mr Brown in correspondence, I'm very happy to take forward a discussion about how we can create the conditions whereby there is a greater propensity to deploy 3-year funding for third sector projects. You know, the government's commitment is clearly expressed on this question. There is a joint agreement which again I cite and which Mr Brown has cited in debate as well, in the joint statement on the relationship at local level between government and the third sector, which states, as a general rule, funders will aim to take a 3-year approach to both grant and contract funding. There will be certain circumstances where that's just not possible, and I don't think members are arguing that it should be in absolutely every case, but I do recognise that members are arguing it should be more prevalent than it is, and I'm certainly very happy to explore with members how best we can deploy that. There are a range of different ways we could do that, up to and including making funding conditional on 3-year deals being in place. That's, you know, it's at the draconian end of the spectrum, but I do think there are a number of interventions we need to make to go beyond exhortation and into implementation.
Okay, Jean, to be followed by Michael.
Cabinet Secretary, there's quite a lot of publicity surrounding a young graduate, I think, who was asked to work in one of the work programmes in England, to work for nothing in a store. And I wonder if that's a topic that's come up in the discussion with the Secretary of State, the forum that you've put together, and if that kind of, if working for nothing even for a couple of weeks is part of any of these programmes that we're developing.
That subject's not been discussed with the Secretary of State, nor was it discussed at the Scottish Employability Forum. I think the Employability Forum probably met before that court case crystallised, if my memory serves me right. I'm pretty sure it did. But I think what I think there's an interesting point that arises out of Jean Urquhart's question as to whether or not we think all interventions are as effective as they could be. And I don't say that to have a go at anybody else. Other people might think some of our interventions aren't that particularly good. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the Scottish Employability Forum progresses in having that discussion about, well, what actually works, what is of benefit to individuals in helping them to make the journey from unemployment into employment and stable support. And I think we should be prepared to have that discussion. And some of these, some of these interventions really, I think we need to challenge to determine whether or not they actually are of any value. And I don't just say that about the example that Jean Urquhart has cited, but about other schemes and other initiatives that we may preside over as well.
And I think, if I may, I think there may well be a time, and certainly a lot of employers, I guess, across Scotland take school pupils secondary pupils for work experience. I think that's quite a different thing, for consideration. Thank you.
Michael.
I can do that. In my capacity in my other committee, I hear quite regularly, and I think quite rightly from across the board, concerns being expressed in terms of the new welfare reforms, the drive by the DWP to do things online, because those who are most disadvantaged, the least likely to be able to use online mechanisms, are the people who need the support and assistance the most. And yet, when we look at this issue of career development and skills, we hear the same argument from, some teachers, from some users, and from some people within Skills Development Scotland themselves, saying that the people who are most need of support, the ones who are least likely to be able to cope with online technology as a means of gaining support that they need, are going to have to use My World of Work. Can you give me some explanation as to why the Scottish Government, amongst others, think that those who are most disadvantaged shouldn't be forced to use online technology when it comes to welfare reform, but you're confident that those who are most deprived and disadvantaged are going to have to rely on it for My World at Work?
I think that would be a fair accusation if the only way people could access information about employment through My World of Work was through My World of Work, which is not the case. My World of Work is there, as I think, and I've seen the system. I think it's absolutely magnificent in terms of giving young people, most of whom will be technologically capable and very interested in the technology aspects and interacting through the technology that's available, to find out information that suits them about the choices that they make about their future careers. But it's not the only show in town. There are also, part of the purpose of My World of Work is to rebalance the way in which advice is available, so that for those who find that difficult, who cannot make that access, who need a bit more support to try to determine their own, the best way to secure their own interests in the long term, can have face-to-face contact with careers advisors, and that remains an essential part of the careers advice system that we have in place. So yes, there is an encouragement for people to use My World of Work as a technology interaction, and as I say, I think it's an excellent system, but there still remains the capability for people to engage in face-to-face discussion with careers advisors to obtain the necessary support, and I think that's entirely appropriate.
I mean, one of the recommendations that the committee made was in relation to one-to-one and the development of more, in terms of work support, work coaching. Can you give us an idea of just sort of what timescales you envisage for expanding that direct contact?
We've put an emphasis on the idea of work coaching, as Mr. McMahon highlights, and we now have the young people who left school in December 2011 and May 2012 who require face-to-face contact have been given the offer to pair up with work coaches, and that was done by January 2013, to make sure that those who require that support have that support available to them.
I thought you were going to give us more information there, so if there's anything else that has been added, do you want to give us that opportunity?
I think is the detail that I've got to share with the committee just now.
Okay, thanks.
Malcolm.
I wasn't on the committee when they did this inquiry, so I'm not so well informed as my colleagues. But I mean, I was very struck by the report. I was very impressed with it when I read it, because it did seem to be very focused, and in particular highlighting the needs of those most disadvantaged and furthest from the labour market. So I just wonder to what, and in the debate, I did speak in the debate, and I observed that, your document did obviously address that issue, just as the previous one had done 7 years ago. But the evidence, such as we have, is that there hasn't really been a step change in support for those who are most disadvantaged in the labour market. So I just wondered to what extent you feel you've had to change the focus of policy in the recent document, or I just wonder to what extent there really has been a shift in focus in the government, or is it going to be, in a kind of way, continuity and business as usual, where we know that the policies haven't really been successful?
I suppose in an ideal world, I would take the view that the focus on those that were furthest removed from the labour market and providing them with the assistance in the past actually did have a beneficial effect, because we saw that translated into the labour market statistics in the period, I suppose, around 2006 to 2008, where there was a marked improvement in the labour market position. And then you get a financial crash, which creates economic dislocation. And it would be nice if these things didn't happen, to interrupt good sustained work to try to tackle these problems. But unfortunately, they happen, and so it then creates an economic dislocation of that type. Clearly, and I think the committee highlighted this in some of its discussions about this question, that clearly creates another factor with which we've got to wrestle within the labour market. So you have an economic shock, rising unemployment. Some of those who have perhaps found it most difficult to get into employment, or have found it most difficult to access the labour market, will probably have those challenges reinforced as a consequence of economic dislocation. What that then means is that we have to be extremely focused in the services that we provide for these individuals, and I think as the way I expressed this in the parliamentary debate was, I was not trying to suggest for a moment that I thought our system and our approach was perfect. I thought we were on a journey to make our employability approach much more cohesive and much more targeted on those who require the most support. And that really remains at the centre of the government's perspective on this issue.
I mean, it's good to hear that, because obviously, I suppose it's always tempting to focus on those that are easier to get into work. It helps targets, costs less, and so on. So I just wonder, I mean, what would you say was the most, well, perhaps the two most significant shifts you've made to refocus it more on the most disadvantaged? What are the two or three things that are really going to make the difference that we haven't really seen to any great extent?
Before I come on to answer that question, can I just consider the question of a concentration of policy on those who are closest to the labour market costs less? I actually don't take that view at all, because in the long run, if we just concentrate on the people who are close to the labour market and get them in, and really just ignore or don't do enough on those who are most disadvantaged and the hardest to get into the labour market, the cost of that for the public purse will be horrific, because we will then get into an entrenched spiral of social problems that will arise from that economic inactivity. So we just cannot afford as a society to allow that to happen. In terms of identifying some of the initiatives that we have done that have focused things the most, the first, I would say, has been the suite of youth employment initiatives that we've taken. And to go back to my answer to the convener earlier on, we did have a particular problem, of a very acute problem of youth unemployment, which resulted in the decision to appoint Angela Constance as the Youth Employment Minister, and to give a much sharper focus on avoiding another lost generation in terms of our employment activities. And I think as we look at the results in terms of labour market statistics and the utilisation of young people's economic activity, we're seeing an impact, a very strong impact being delivered in that respect. So that's one area where I think we've made that impact. Secondly, I think we the move to the employability fund and the emphasis particularly on the role of the third sector is designed to reach some of the hardest to reach individuals. And I've made no secret of my view that I see the third sector as having capabilities of reaching some of the most disadvantaged individuals in our society much more effectively than I think the public sector often reaches those individuals in terms of the approaches that we take. And I'm keen to make sure that we sustain that third sector involvement, which essentially gets to the nub of the point that Mr Brown was making earlier on about the sustainability of funding in those channels.
Well, I'd certainly agree with that about the third sector. I think in the debate I mentioned Bernardo's works in my constituency. So could you just say, perhaps I should know this already, but could you say what additional funding is available to third sector employability projects?
Well, that will be reflected in a range of different opportunities through the Employability Fund. Increasingly, the wider third sector interventions the government is making, for example, in the strengthening of social enterprises through the Enterprise Growth Fund and the Just Enterprise Fund, are designed to do exactly that. And all of these measures are focused on essentially strengthening the third sector to make a greater contribution. Now, one of the observations I'd make about the UK government's work programme is a number of third sector organisations are involved in the delivery of that work programme. I think there would have been a benefit if those organisations had been more directly involved in it than they are acting on behalf of the providers, because I think that would have created a more efficient and a more joined up approach. We also, of course, have the Community Jobs Scotland, which has been part of a Scottish Government programme which has helped the third sector in this respect.
Obviously, I accept what you're saying about the costs in the longer run of not doing the work that we're talking about. But I suppose, again, going back to Bernardo's works, I mean, some of the points that I made in the debate where, you know, they keep people on board for a longer period of time, more intensive support. So in the short run, it probably is costing more than some other programs. But I suppose the other point in relation to that is that they're taking people, quite a lot of people who are in their 20s, and I suppose that's another concern that was raised in the committee's report, the increasing focus on, we accept the importance of the late teens, but I suppose there is a worry reflected in the committee's report also about many people in their 20s who are also in that kind of situation.
I wouldn't want my comments to be misinterpreted. I quite accept that finding solutions for those who are furthest from the labour market will be more expensive. I just think if we don't tackle that in the short term, it will be even more expensive with the entrenched social problems that will arise as a consequence. I think the government has had, since the latter part of 2011, a very, very relentless focus on the youth employment position. I think we are now beginning to see significant progress being achieved here, and as a consequence, I think the approach that we've taken on the Employability Fund has started to reflect a response to the committee's concern about the support for people in an older age group, which I acknowledge is a significant factor.
Thank you. I want to return to the issue of careers advice, because this was obviously an issue that was debated some months ago in Parliament. There was the idea that people had to rely on My World of Work was posited then, but you know, you've clearly and fairly stated that there is a range of interventions available. But could you not go further? It would not also be fair to say that actually the system that the government's put in place now, far from being the case that people have to rely on My World of Work, actually identifies those that are in greatest danger of struggling to access the guidance needed there, actually prioritised to get the most significant intervention to provide them with that guidance?
I think that would be a fair reflection on the shift to the work coaches idea, and that essentially provides some of the very practical support that individuals will require. The fact that in the careers advice system, we have by making My World of Work available in the fashion that it is available, where individuals can readily access that, satisfy their requirements, have no need to use resources, people resources to take forward any sourcing of advice. It obviously makes resources and advice available to those who need it more. So, and certainly my experience of observing the utilisation and the effectiveness of my world of work gives me confidence that it's meeting, the whole website and interactive activity is meeting needs of those that can be satisfied by it, but it also frees up resources for those who require more detailed intervention.
But in saying that as well, of course, I think it would also be instructive to refer back to the debate as well. I wonder if you would to reflect on the Minister for Youth Employment. I think she did make the point that anyone who wants to access careers advice and appointment with a careers advisor can get that.
Yeah, of course, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, colleagues and Cabinet Secretary. That appears to be the end of this morning's question session. So thank you very much to yourself and your officials. We've now been in session for 100 minutes, so I'm going to have a 5 minute, indeed. I'm going to therefore call a 5 minute recess and natural break. discussion about last night's Barcelona-Milan match, so we'll restart the session in just a few seconds. Okay, folks? Okay, so the fourth item on our agenda today is to take evidence from COSLA on the committee's Demographic Change and an Ageing Population Report, which was published on the 11th of February this year. And therefore welcome to the meeting Councillors Kevin Keenan and Peter Johnson, and also Ron Cully and Andy Whitty. So I'd like to welcome you very much to our committee this morning. And I'd also like you to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think the opening statement falls to myself. Can I say that COSLA are delighted to be able to provide oral evidence? We certainly support the committee's agenda and recognise that the impact of demographic change is of the first order, and if it's going to be second to anything, and it's marginal, would be that of tackling health inequalities. Thank you for introducing our spokesman. I'm the Health and Care spokesperson for COSLA. Kevin.
I'm the Capacity and Resources spokesperson for COSLA.
And Ron.
Chief Officer, Health and Social Care, COSLA.
And last but not least, Andy is.
I'm the Policy Manager in the Finance team at COSLA.
Local government has long known about this challenge related to demographic change. We've undertaken modelling work since 2010 to look at the future funding gap between the services we will need to provide and the amount of funding available. This revealed that a gap will rise to almost £3 billion by 2016-17 across all council services, and the greatest impacts we believe are likely to be felt in social care, housing and welfare. Our ageing population and the consequential increase in demand is only the headline. By dint of this change, we will have a smaller working age population, having to bear the costs of supporting a larger non-working age population. We will also, we believe, have a more atomised community, with more single households, more people potentially moving away from the towns and villages they have grown up in, and the communities they've grown up in. And this in turn could have a wider impact, such as producing a deficit in the number of unpaid carers, family support for people in their own new homes, and mounting greater pressure on formal state provision. Local government is undertaking a range of actions to try to close this gap. These include redesigning services, modernising working practices, driving through efficiencies and engaging in sensibly planned shared services where these are appropriate. One example clearly is that of preventative spending. COSLA is of the view that preventative spending approaches must be the focus for future financial planning. Change funds, we believe, are a start, but we would accept that the evidence of the shift towards prevention is inconclusive so far. We've witnessed significant levels of innovation in delivering new upstream interventions, but we believe we've yet to fully capture the efficacy of those, or indeed lever out the resources downstream. COSLA is therefore asking similar questions to those raised in paragraphs 60 and 61 of the committee's second report. Whether the emphasis on the shift towards a preventative spending approach will result in sufficient savings in the short to medium term to address any future gap remains to be examined fully. Our key message is, even with the actions taken by local government and our partners, we believe it's highly unlikely that the funding gap will be entirely closed, and what's more, it could well remain substantial. A second key message is that we cannot separate out our efforts to support earlier intervention from the broader public spending constraints and the increasing levels of demand. Unfortunately, it tends to be upstream interventions that are most squeezed under conditions of financial constraint, which could mitigate against our efforts to address what some have termed failure demand. COSLA is therefore aware of the risk that shorter term issues become a distraction. For example, a focus on the short term in relation to the current financial challenges and other agendas, including welfare reform. Colleagues, that would be our opening remarks, and we would be happy now to take questions and look forward to engaging with you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And when I put questions, it won't necessarily be specifically to you. Either yourself or your colleagues can feel free to answer these questions. So I'll start with a few openers, and then I'll obviously allow colleagues round the table to come in as they wish. Well, I'm going to refer to, you gave us actually two documents, actually, which were quite similar, but the one I'll refer to is really the written submission by COSLA in advance of giving oral evidence to the committee, so that people know which one I'm referring to if I'm going to quote from it. And of course, just an initial quote is basically something which you've obviously touched on in your opening, which is in paragraph 7, which is that COSLA is calling for a fundamental discussion about how the funding gap can be addressed. I'm just wondering how you feel that discussion should be structured, given the kind of resource constraints, and basically how we actually take on and address that gap, given the economic situation that we're in.
Wow, a huge question. Ron, do you want to have first stab at that?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and there are several parts to the way in which we would answer that. I mean, I think for a number of years, actually, COSLA has been asking for some reflection on the overall financial arrangements that support local government and indeed our partners at local levels. And that has ranged from a contribution to the Beveridge report, which of course was published a few years ago, through the Christie Commission report, and into more recent discussions with government as well. And I think we would probably see the areas of discussion to explore two fundamental issues, and one is around the policy framework that we have in Scotland. So if, for example, that we want to focus on preventive spend into the future, and if we recognise that in current circumstances we live in highly constrained environment in terms of public spending, there's a question about priorities within that context. And what we want to open up with government and others is a question around about the priorities that we attach to different policy agendas. So that would be one area that we would like to take this conversation forward. The other, and I tie this more specifically to issues around about health and social care, would be about the way in which we structure the funding of care and support into the future. You'll be aware as a committee that the UK government recently commissioned Andrew Dilnot to examine this issue at a UK level. And although the UK government haven't faithfully pursued his recommendations, nonetheless that was an attempt to grapple with the big structural issues that we'll face into the future in terms of how we finance care, particularly into our old age. And what I would say about that is that although a lot of the media commentary around about the Dilnot work has focused in on the idea that this is about trying to protect the assets of individuals as they have to draw upon formal support from the state in their older years. Actually, one of the big components of the Dilnot argument was missing in that analysis, which is to say what he really wanted to do was to allow people to plan for their older age, to make decisions as younger adults so that when they came to need support into the future, they had effectively insured themselves against that risk. His point was that in every other area of our lives, we try and make those sort of decisions around about whether you're insuring yourself as a motorist or a householder. But it's something that we don't do, is to insure ourselves in that respect. Now, one argument would be we shouldn't need to, because the state, through the formal taxation system, should be there to provide support. But I think what Dilnot recognised is that the consequences of demographic change mean that it would be difficult to envisage the state supporting all people at all times during those years of their lives. So I think that we need to give some thought to those sorts of issues in Scotland. Clearly, we have a policy framework here which is at odds in some respects with the Dilnot work. We have free personal care for a start. And so we would need to give some thought to how that type of discussion would play out. We don't have the answers in terms of how you would structure the funding of care and support, but we do think that there needs to be some thought given to that matter.
Any colleagues got additional comments?
We'd all like to add to that. Kevin, do you want?
I mean, I think that obviously the point is we probably should never bury our head in the sand. We know what is where we're moving towards, obviously COSLA and its partner agencies work towards trying to reduce the individuals going into hospital, perhaps, and put in the early interventions that make a difference. The pot of money that's going into that at the moment possibly isn't enough, but there is, the demographics suggest that there's another sweeping of people coming in just to fill that gap that we clear. So it's unclear as to the total direction. I think that there needs to be the sort of joint up discussion between all in government to see how we best move forward in making a difference. I mean, at the Finance Committee, and when we've met with the Finance Minister, we clearly discuss the pressures that we see across the whole of the local government sector. And clearly in budgets that we've seen this year, then there is severe pressures out there. We need to best use resources to make the difference to people's lives.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a number of sort of higher level aspects to this, and clearly it's about partnership, working with the organisations that local government work with and can deliver through. There's examples of you know, shared service. I think it's about looking at the best way to deliver that capacity within the local community. I think it's about and looking at the role and responsibility with the community as well, from the Christie report, not doing things to communities but doing things with them, and developing that aspect of the discussion. And I think another sort of high level element is you know, taking demand out of the system, of whatever aspect that's dealing with, and really depending on what area of local government work that you're looking at, there would be you know, different ways of taking it forward. And I think it's that being able to have the local solutions that deal with that particular area's particular needs is an important aspect going forward, and that sort of local government interaction at that local level of understanding its communities.
I could just add, from my perspective as the health and care spokesman, I touched in our introductory remarks about preventative spending. I think it's implicit in that if we're going to really shift the balance of care, that there will have to be a shift of resource, and we'd want to engage in that. I'm sure you're aware that in the last decade, spending in acute health has virtually doubled. And yet we would view that as meeting failure demand. When I was addressing the COSLA conference at the weekend, last weekend, I was talking about an ancient Chinese lesson for us, that in ancient China, they believed that a doctor's job was to keep people healthy, and that if a patient became ill, they actually stopped the doctor's pay. Now, I should clarify that I'm not advocating that we stop paying doctors because patients become ill, but the lesson from that is that it's investing in keeping people healthy that's important. And we really need to have a discussion about how we can shift the resource that we currently deploy in looking after failure demand into preventative spending. And for me, that would be the key part of discussions we'd be looking to have.
I think I'm going to allow other colleagues to explore that particular aspect, because I'm pretty sure they will. But one of the things that came out of the report obviously was about pooling of resources between, for example, health and local government, and the need to actually, you know, to get the optimum outcomes. And I just want, you know, Highland, for example, have been quoted to as a number of occasions of actually doing that in a lot of areas. How does COSLA feel about that? About more sharing of budgets in order to get these better outcomes?
COSLA is certainly not opposed to the sharing of budgets between partners, and obviously indeed the model of local community planning partnerships is the best way forward to integrate services and make a real difference. And you know, there's many different models across the country that are all good. There's obviously a monitoring group within COSLA to see how best they perform. There's a clear commitment to pooled resources and making a difference, because we realise that the pot of money continues to diminish, and the best way is working together and making a difference.
I think we've had a very positive engagement with your government colleagues in terms of the Health and Care Integration Bill that's going to be coming shortly before Parliament. We continue to engage positively within that. And Convener, you mentioned the Highland model. There are other existing models, such as the West Lothian model, which I'm very familiar with, given my role within West Lothian Council. And the West Lothian model is the second option that we think will be likely to be available to local authorities within the coming legislation, which does have currently aligned budgets, but following the legislation, we'd look to move to integrated budgets. From my perspective, I see health and care integration as a massive opportunity for actually more effectively tackling not just health and care inequalities, but also an opportunity to do it more efficiently and more effectively. I can give you examples of that within, again, coming from West Lothian, where if you look at efficiently, an integrated council and health management structure can save £300,000 annually for the West Lothian Council alone. But it also offers more than that. It's an opportunity, I think, to build on some building bricks which we will be advocating as COSLA to the Ministerial Group on Health Inequalities, where we're saying we have to develop a kind of toolkit. And within that, what I think we're talking about is that we need an evidence base. We should start with a community health profile, and that should deliver the evidence base that you then move to a commissioning model driven by the Health and Care Partnership with councils and our health colleagues working in partnership to deliver the services that will then meet the needs identified by the community health profile. And that's something which I think is a massive opportunity and which gives us a real chance of delivering preventative spending, tackling health inequalities, and doing the long acquired or long term ambition of getting more from less.
I mean, we have government at different levels, local government, Scottish and UK level. We've got lots of different local authorities in Scotland, 32, and we've got different political parties, and all got different views and opinions, etc. Is there, however, a potential for, in specific core areas, a kind of consensus approach whereby all the political parties, if you like, across the local authorities and working with the Scottish Government can have a kind of joint approach to some of these issues, do you feel? I mean, there'll be obviously differences of opinion in other areas, but is there a potential for that, do you think, given the kind of...
If I was answering that, I say that's the umbrella group that COSLA is. It reaches the consensus when delivering the policy and looks for that policy to be rolled out across the 32 local authorities. I think there's a commitment to delivering the best across Scotland, no matter what council or what council area, and that policies are developed in that manner. So I'm convinced that we've got that and that mechanism in place to deliver the best through using that. And hopefully that answers you. That's the type of organisation that we are. It's about reaching that kind of consensus, and everybody's committed to making a difference to the people in their area. Everybody that gets involved in politics, I think, is interested in making a difference.
Sure, but I mean, best practice, in these areas doesn't seem to be shared perhaps as much as it could be. And if we look at planning, what we've taken evidence, for example, to show that Edinburgh City Council has got a 10-year plan, for example, to look at how things are going to impact on their budgets, with demographic change, etc. But other local authorities have said, well, we're only going to look at 3 years. So it's about how we actually, given the kind of major challenge that we face in terms of demographics, I'm just looking to see whether or not there is further room for not just, this is COSLA's position, this agreement, but actually having real kind of solid kind of commitment from member organisations to some of these kind of specific areas.
COSLA's would certainly look at best practice across every local authority, and that would be a drive towards that. I mean, we're starting to look at key performance indicators against each authority and see whether each authority is meeting up well against each other. When it comes to sort of planning and budgets, I think we'll look a lot deeper than the 3 years that we put on paper. And I think that it's important that that level of discussion happens, but as to whether it's the best thing is to put it out in paper by way of plan for the next 10 years, or most people are either comfortable, perhaps on housing being a 5-year budget programme, and in local government, because the unknowns of where a spending review would likely to be, sticking a bit closer to the spending review, which is usually around the 3-year mark. However, if there was to be if there was to be benefits seen, then I'm sure that the officers and councillors would be well pleased to put a sort of longer projection on things.
Yeah, I was just going to come in on a couple of those themes. I think just in terms of COSLA, first of all, absolutely, we fulfil that function as part of our duties, which is to say, if we do know of good practice, you've cited Edinburgh City, then absolutely we'll undertake to make sure that that's shared with our members, either politically or through our professional associations. So we have a role in that, and we take that role seriously. The other question was about consensus and the extent to which we can arrive at that. I think that's a crucial question over the next few years, particularly because some of the issues that we will have to deal with are potentially divisive, and the challenge will be in an arena where democratic politics is by its nature competitive, and people will try and secure competitive advantage within that context. There will be challenges to that consensus. So to give you an example of that, one of the big themes that we need to grapple with is the idea of disinvesting in the acute sector in Scotland so that we can redeploy those resources more effectively upstream. And I think just now there's probably a policy consensus around about that. But our fear would be that that breaks down at the point at which you actually have to make decisions to take beds out of hospitals to say, no, we're no longer going to provide this in your locality. And that's where the real tension comes in. So I think consensus is hugely important. And the more that we can consolidate that over the next few years, the easier it will be to make these very difficult decisions, frankly.
Yes, I mean, in your final paragraph, for example, of your report, you say a preventive approach to long-term housing supply may be set back as a consequence of competing social policies at UK level. It has caused us to view that effective action to address longer-term demographic challenges to housing supply require not just adequate resources but consistent policies at all levels of government. I mean, when you say consistent policies at all levels of government, is this over a long period of time? Is it? I mean, what can you be a bit more specific about what kind of consistency and what kind of policy you're looking for in terms of that housing supply?
I should say first of all
Types
that
of housing,
unfortunately our housing spokesperson can't be with us today, and housing isn't our particular expertise. We would be happy to get back to you with a detailed response to that, but I'm happy for any of my colleagues to answer.
You can also draw a more general observation from that, though, which is that on the one hand, we want to work within a policy context which prioritises early intervention, prevention, shifting resources upstream, and there's an element within that context which is about longer term planning. The challenge, of course, is that public authorities, and by that I don't just mean councils, are inevitably pulled back to dealing with the demands of service provision within an everyday context, which actually can act or militate against the idea of supporting early intervention and prevention. So some of the statutory duties that councils have, NHS boards have, can actually require a certain type of behaviour which is at odds with the idea of using money flexibly to invest in the longer term. I don't think that there's an easy answer to that other than to say that we need to try and strike a balance and we need to try and innovate. Over the last few years, we've identified things like the Change Fund as a mechanism to do that. I think the committee will be aware that that work is ongoing. It's not yet concluded or indeed conclusive in terms of the success of that venture. But that balance will be important, and we need to make sure that short-term pressures don't prevent more strategic, long-term thinking.
Open it out to colleagues, and that's in terms of paragraph 18, where you say spending figures from the Scottish Government projected to 2030 show the funding required for residential home care for adults is set to increase at around 3 times the rate anticipated for NHS services. Now, is that a plea for a rebalancing of some of the Scottish Government's financial allocations to local government relative to the NHS, or is it something which would be covered by integration of budgets?
think it is clearly something from our perspective that should be covered through the health and care integration agenda and how these budgets are then allocated. But it has significant challenges for us. I mean, I think the figures speak for themselves. It costs round about £300 to £400 a week to keep someone supported living independently in their own home. That compares to around £4,500 a week for an acute bed in a hospital, or something like £500 to £600 if they're going to be within the current care home settlement. So where do people want to live? They want to be supported in their own homes. That's where we believe they can be living independently and well. That's where they want to be. We do not have, as yet, we think, from a COSLA perspective, the best working relationship with the care home sector that we could have. I mean, for example, we would argue that we simply procure care at the moment. We simply buy places to the National Care Home contract, but we don't have the ability to shape the market, if you want to term it as such. And one of the key objectives that I think we have would be to move into our health and care partnerships having the ability to commission care and shape that. For example, one of the opportunities we have, if we're going to reduce unplanned front door admissions to the acute sector, there is an opportunity to do that locally, keeping people, for example, by going into a step-up facility rather than going from their own home immediately to an A&E department. And likewise, if we're going to meet the targets for delayed discharges, which again are opportunities to release considerable resources, a different kind of commissioning in the care home sector would allow step-down facilities to be made available. Some of these already exist throughout the country, but it's not well, it is best practice, but it's not something that is run out across all our council areas. So the opportunity to use budgets more effectively, I think, is there for us to grasp through health and care integration, and we're looking forward to realising these opportunities.
No further comments on that question. Okay, I'll open it out to colleagues around the table. First person to ask a question will be Jamie, to be followed by John.
Thank you very much. And in his opening remarks, Peter Johnson referred a number of times to the welfare reform agenda, which, as colleagues are aware of, I've got an interest in, along with Michael McMahon, with us both being on the Welfare Reform Committee at this place. And in your paper at 10, you refer to financial pressures arising from welfare reform, which in turn will contribute to future pressure as a result of demographic change and an ageing population. Welfare reform is likely to be another driver towards an older but poorer population with increasing needs on services. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about that and say what you think the specific likely impacts of welfare reform are going to be on local government.
Welfare reform, every time someone comes to talk to you about it and give you a bit more evidence or advice, then you usually come up with, that's another disaster that we're walking into. I think that some of the pressures that may come towards council will be coming in the social care aspect of the amount of monies that are available by way of discretionary grants, if it's housing or social fund. They're exhaustible. They're no a never-ending fund. And obviously we're starting to look at food banks and the like and how councils can support. Indeed, obviously, there's an increase in the advice people that we've taken on to try to help people attract the benefit if they're still entitled to something, and make sure that that there is no one missing out. I think the welfare reform makes a difference in housing as to whether when someone gets a universal benefit, will they pay their rent, and that's a concern for social landlords as well as council landlords. I think there's just so many aspects that the welfare reform will make life difficult for individuals, and they'll look towards local government picking up the slack, as it were, or being there for support that throws budgets in every sort of direction.
I mean, you mentioned the social fund, and of course we're now getting the welfare fund that's been put in place with an agreement between COSLA and the Scottish Government. I think I'm right in saying figures were presented to the Welfare Reform Committee that suggest that the amount that's been granted to that fund has never been reached in the last, I can't remember, it was 5 years in terms of the funds seeking to replace, but clearly you're suggesting there are concerns that it's not an inexhaustible fund. I mean, is your concern that the other changes that are put in place are going to increase demand on that type of fund?
I think they'll increase demand on people looking in that area for assistance. I think that, you know, pressures of bedroom tax would have been something that in housing, and well, if you were looking at housing and what's housing needs or what is it likely to be, then perhaps building 3 and 4 bedroom houses that are in demand and still having this need for a single bedroom house is something that we'll have to grapple with as we move forward. There's just so many aspects that'll make a difference. I think, Andy, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I mean, I think there's a whole raft of areas to do with welfare reform that have some concerns for local government. I mean, I think the move to universal credit and the direct payments and the impact that might have on people's paying of rent or council tax, and certainly there's been some small pilots reporting already down in England showing a reduction in rent payment once direct payments had been established. Clearly there's more pilots happening before it goes on, but I think that's an area of you know, particular concern there. And I think alongside that and a parallel issue has been that one area that seems to be getting preferential protection is water payments with Water Direct, establishing a means to not just deal with debt but prevent people who are most vulnerable falling into debt with regards their water payments. But that same approach has not been extended across for council rents and for council tax. And so it does seem that water has been prioritised over other bills, and I think it would be good to look at a more universal system and approach there. I think another area is the council tax benefit and the reduction, the stopping of that, the reduction of the monies that's come from London, the £40 million gap that was identified, and there's been local government and Scottish government worked together and came to a one-year deal of how to deal with this to prevent it impacting the people who are most vulnerable. But that is only a one-year deal, and I think we need to see how that's going to go forward and what sort of solution we have longer term, and those discussions are still happening really. So there's a number of pressures, particularly with welfare reform.
Just to, sorry.
I think from my perspective, my frustration is the lack of joined up thinking here, because we're all committed working towards tackling health inequalities, preventative spending, and yet we have welfare reform that is actively trying to dismantle what we're looking to do. I mean, for example, you have a situation where somebody bringing up a family will have a 25% reduction in their housing benefit. They're going to have to choose between eating, heating their home, feeding their children, buying family essentials, and finding that extra money to pay their rent. And I think this is an example of some of the things we were saying about the focus being shifted from what we're looking to do, long-term investment in tackling health inequalities and preventative spend, early intervention, and then suddenly having to firefight. It's just such a pity that it wasn't a joined-up agenda here, with welfare reform actually helping us achieve the targets that we're all looking to work towards.
Yeah, I mean, you're not the first to comment on this agenda cutting right across a whole other range of measures that we're trying to take forward. Councillor Keenan mentioned there the possibility of having to consider the types of housing stock that will need to be provided in light of the bedroom tax, for example.
Jamie, it's not really about bedroom tax this session, it's about demography.
Well, I'm aware of that, but also
keep it on the kind of theme.
Well, I'm trying to, in terms of, I mean, clearly it's been the issue of welfare reforms been raised, but I think I've recalled when we were in this inquiry we talked about housing and how welfare reform would and the types of houses that would have to be built, and that's what we're going to turn to, if that's okay, convener. Thank you.
Stay focused.
I will do. In terms of the types of houses that will have to be provided, and that was something we explored previously, and I think it was suggested registered social landlords are sort of reluctant to build more one-bedroom properties, but you've also referred to the fact that there'll be more single people as a result of demographic change. Hopefully that's me keeping focused. You know, that might lead to a conclusion that we need more single bedroom properties. You know, the combination of these changes. You know, is there likely to be more single bedroom properties being built by local government, or do you feel the same as other registered social landlords, that it doesn't offer you the flexibility in terms of other housing needs?
I think the debate needs to happen at some stage, because if you're looking at 3,300 people that rent a house for Dundee City Council being affected by the bedroom tax, then the chances are that we need to consider housing investment and how that would happen in the future. So yes, you might have to change the direction of travel and where we invest. I think that social rented landlords are reluctant at the moment, I believe, to invest because they're feeling under cost pressures, and the cost pressures that they perhaps will head under is if a number of people receive a universal benefit and don't pay their rent. I think at the moment a lot of things need to unfold in relation to the welfare reform bill, and I think it will affect, and I suppose and I say people will present themselves to social work and the like, or for our benefits advice, and these things become a cost pressure in local government.
Okay. John, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thanks, convener. I mean, a lot of this debate, you kind of got an air of doom and gloom about it, that it's all grim. I mean, has COSLA got any feeling that there's actually good news, that, you know, people are living longer? And one example is, for example, people can work longer. I think you do touch on that about people don't have to retire at 60 or 65 or whatever it happens to be. Are there any positives in this, do you think?
Well, people are living longer. The key is keeping them living healthily longer. And I actually think the agenda, I touched on this earlier, of supporting people to live independently and well in their own homes is a very positive agenda, because that's where people want to be. I think there are positive things, but underlying this, from our perspective, is that we require to tackle the glaring health inequalities that still exist within this living longer. And I can give you examples from areas of Livingston Newtown, where a child born in the Ladywell area of Livingston, for example, which I've represented since 1985, a child born in certain areas of that can expect to live 11 years less than a child born on the same day just 10 miles up the road in the leafy suburbs of Muirston. Now, that is not acceptable, and we have to accept that there is an agenda here that we have to tackle. So I don't think it's a case of doom and gloom. I think it's being realistic and focusing our attention on the problems that we need to try and solve.
And do you think there's any, in the short to medium term, is there any scope for really reducing these inequalities, or do we have to accept that this is a very, very long-term project, both in the sense of actual life expectancy, big gap between one area and another, but also, especially, for example, men in my constituency, unhealthy life expectancy a lot shorter than their actual life expectancy?
I think it's a bit of both, John. I think there are opportunities to make significant changes in the quality of people's life through early intervention, and some of these are currently underway. There's a project in Armadale in West Lothian, for example, through the Health and Care Partnership in West Lothian, that is looking to tackle obesity in young children. So that's going to have, hopefully, an immediate early impact. But likewise, we have to recognise that tackling health inequalities, and again, it's why we need consistency of approach and a consensus that's going to take us through this, and not keep being distracted and change course. But that's going to take a time to see the benefits of that. But it's a prize, we think, that's worth working towards.
Just on
Sorry, just on the doom and gloom question. I mean, I think it's an important question. It really is, because there would be a concern if public authorities were simply articulating a view of the world which was basically dispiriting. I don't think that's what we're trying to do. I think on the policy agenda that we're pursuing, I think we have a very positive message there, particularly about the way in which people can live into their old age in a healthier way. The other element of that, of course, is that we have a vision of communities which is about a more vibrant, better connected community infrastructure, where there is greater capacity for people to be sustained with friends and neighbours and so on. All of that is hugely positive. The challenging part of it, of course, is the public finances and how you support that. And that's where it is more, frankly, doom and gloom. But it's about trying to balance all of that together.
Okay, thanks.
I think earlier, John Swinney gave an answer in relation to people in employment and realising that in 2008 things fell to pieces a bit. And I think the game changer that now happens for us is the welfare reform, and indeed, obviously, the amount of monies that will come out of our local communities. In Dundee, it's looking like it could be anything from 14 to 28 million. That will affect families big style and make a difference to the quality of food that they can buy, and indeed make the choices as to whether to put the heating on or feed the kids or feed a drug habit if that's as bad as. So I think the game changer that's happening at the moment leads you towards a bit of doom and gloom. However, there is a lot of positive work going on in local government to make a difference, make a change.
And that kind of ties in, because I was going to ask, I mean, you've mentioned in your comments, and it's been mentioned elsewhere, about this shift between, trying to bring resources more to, especially early years, or upstream, or whatever we want to call it. And obviously what you've just said about welfare reform probably makes that more difficult. I mean, is the shift, has it got to be linked to between the health services and the social care and other local authority services, or within local authority services, is it possible to shift resources from the kind of more acute elderly to the younger people?
There's two elements to that. I think you can shift resources laterally within a defined population group. So, for example, within the local authority provision of care and support for older people, we would probably want to see a greater proportion of our finance spent on supporting people at home as opposed to care homes. So that lateral shift can happen within a defined population group. There's then a question, an intergenerational question ultimately about the relative priorities that we have in terms of early years versus older people. And again, as inevitably, it's again a question of balance and the extent to which you can channel investment upstream into things like the early years while being faithful to the agenda that we want to pursue for other parts of the population. Clearly, it can't be all or nothing.
I think if we sort of look at Dundee's budget and say that the sort of extremes of Dundee's budget is, yes, we've got 600 or 700 looked after children, and we've got an ageing population that we need to put money into the social work budget to manage to cope with. A lot of work going on within local government to make a difference to the looked after children and their educational outcomes, and the educational outcome looking towards and delivering them into employability at a much later stage. So big focus on, but a real cost pressure in doing so. So there's a lot of great work going on, but there is maybe more people that will present themselves still looking for that level. So.
And I mean, the point got made there about care homes and, you'd rather people at home than in care homes. And I think the point was made earlier that can local authorities shape care homes? I mean, I just wonder, I think Glasgow is in the process of building 5 quite large care homes, presumably with that purpose of being able to shape what goes on. Is that common throughout Scotland, or is that unusual?
It's still relatively unusual. Local authorities are increasingly actually going the other way, divesting themselves of the responsibility for direct provision within care homes. We only have about 15% of the total market now, and that's why the relationship with the private sector is hugely important. And the agenda that we want to progress in respect of that is to envisage an arrangement whereby the commissioning agendas of health and social care partnerships become the bedrock of how we actually shape the local care home market. And it's actually quite difficult to do that just now. Care homes often build speculatively without necessarily having had discussions with local authorities beforehand. And the other thing is we haven't been able to really innovate as much as we have in other sectors in respect of care homes. So they still provide a very traditional type of service, and that's what we want to change into the future. So I think there is a change agenda there, but we've just not really gripped it strongly enough yet.
And are local authorities not involved because they haven't got the resources or because they choose not to be involved in that area, would you say?
I mean, obviously, it's a mixed picture across Scotland. It's certainly true that it's more expensive to provide care in-house than it is to procure that from the private or voluntary sector. The national care home contract rates are less than the rates that local authorities would have for in-house provision. So there's an economic advantage from a council's perspective to outsource that. But it's also, I suppose, a wider question about the priorities of individual councils in that respect, and that's why you do have a mix. You mentioned Glasgow. Other authorities have completely divested themselves of care homes. Dumfries and Galloway, for example, has none. So it is a mixed picture across Scotland, but in general terms, it's a very small proportion of the overall market.
Okay. I mean, that takes us on, I think, I was going to mention about housing. There's obviously a variety in there as well, and we've had quite a lot of evidence at the committee. You know, do we just need more mainstream housing? Do we need more very sheltered? How do we do that? I mean, is there a COSLA view on that, or is it just accept we need a bit of everything? I realise your housing person's not here, so...
Thank you for that. We have
Yes.
to give you that caveat. I'm happy for colleagues...
I mean, we were really keen to ensure that the housing strategy for older people, which you may have seen, was closely aligned to the work on reshaping care for older people. And the reason for that is that obviously there is a continuum which, in terms of the care and support that people need, which runs right from acute hospital provision right through to the housing requirements of individuals as they enter into their older age. And what we thought was important there was that the local authorities and partners were fully equipped to plan effectively through housing needs assessments and align those planning mechanisms to the commissioning agendas of health and social care partnerships. So in other words, we need to ensure into the future that there is a strong fit between the housing sector and the health and social care agenda, and that's something that we'll continually have to work on. Some of it inevitably comes down to how people choose to live their lives. Do we anticipate, for example, that as people enter into their older age that they want to downsize, choose different types of housing? Perhaps. But ultimately, we need to give thought to the importance of individual choice within that arrangement and factor that into the planning, the housing needs assessment process. So it's difficult to answer it in the abstract. I think that question has to be grounded on the basis of a local needs assessment, which most partnerships will undertake.
Right, and I mean, in that, do you feel there's a good relationship with the third sector, including housing associations? Because we've had a bit of an impression that maybe it's a wee bit patchy across the country.
I think in general we have an improving relationship. I don't think it's always been as strong as it could have been, but certainly in the last few years there has been an increasing policy focus in bringing the housing agenda closer to the health and care agenda, and I think that's only improved the dialogue between the third sector and the statutory sector.
Okay, thanks. I mean, the final area I just want to ask you about, you mentioned universal benefits in your comments. I mean, does COSLA have a view on universal benefits and where we should be going on that?
We've probably made cases to ministers where we feel that, if someone was in difficulty, we would like rent to be paid directly to the landlord, as we feel that there is a potential for, or not the landlord, but the local authority or the social rented landlord.
Or universal benefits in the sense of what gets charged and what doesn't get charged, rather than, were you meaning universal credit?
Yeah, no, I thought you were meaning
Sorry.
universal credit. Yeah.
I think John, we would argue that there has to be a balance between universal benefits and more targeted initiatives. I mean, if you look at, for example, the preventative and early intervention agenda, these would be at best used in a targeted and focused way. But I think we would accept that there are benefits from universal benefits. And I suppose what we're arguing is we'd like a discussion about how to best strike the balance between both.
Right, so, I mean, because there's been quite a lot of debate at Parliament and I guess amongst local authorities on this kind of issue as well. So you wouldn't be going as far as suggesting that we charge people for being in hospital or anything like that?
Absolutely not.
No. Okay.
I think that I would say that we need to try and look at the debate in light of if we're looking at a 3% cut in budgets to local government or local authorities, then the challenges become much more difficult as we move forward, and chances are we need to have a debate at some time.
And I think we've focused our work in that question. It's not that we've not thought about it, but we've focused our work in that question on process rather than substance. So we haven't looked at a suite of universal benefits and said, yeah, that one's good, that one's can go. What we have said is that we need to think about a process through which local authorities and their partners at that level can go, and indeed that we can pursue with the Scottish Government in respect of the correct balance that we strike between universal and targeted in more straitened economic times. So it's a conversation we want to have, and we're pressed to have that conversation. It's just that we haven't got to the position where we've identified the relative value of different universal benefits.
Right, so, but at some stage you'll be doing that and we might get it in the public domain as to which you think are good ones and which you think are bad ones.
Well, we'll take forward our discussions with government on that.
I think that when we have our discussions with government, it's about how best we focus and target and eventually and discuss the cost pressures in relation to local government. And we do that on a fairly regular basis, hoping that it doesn't fall on stony ground and that John manages to come up with a pocket of money for some time. But however, we realise that we've got to keep putting the case for where we see the cost pressures within local government and bringing that forward to ministers to try to make a difference.
Thanks so much.
And, you know, all of this becomes topics for discussion when the spending review comes up, along obviously with all the other cost pressures as well, and funding aspects for local government when the next spending review discussions start.
I suppose we'll have to be realistic and say that we would always like things to get better. We realise that there's difficult times out there and we need to make difficult choices.
Okay, Malcolm, to follow by Jean.
Well, that was really interesting. I mean, I suppose I'm working from the second paper, unlike the convener, but both in the second paper and in your in Ron Cully's statement, he did raise this issue about the Dilnot review in England, which is quite interesting because, I mean, if you impose something like the Dilnot solution on top of free personal care, then you end up with a lot more public expenditure when the general tenor of your argument is that we've got too many cost pressures already. So I'm just a bit curious about why you're throwing Dilnot into the pot unless your hidden agenda actually is to get rid of free personal care.
I was raising Dilnot because whether or not you agree with the conclusions, and I didn't incidentally purport to endorse the recommendations that he put to the UK government. What I was ultimately saying is that he has established a review which looks at the question of demographic change and the future funding requirements of social care. And I think that's something which I think we definitely need to pursue. What the conclusion of that process is, we don't necessarily have a view on. What we do have a view on is the need to have a conversation about how we pay for care into our older years. And the reason for that is that I think there's a danger sometimes that we think of demographic change as tomorrow's problem. I mean, as the committee knows from the evidence that you've taken over the last period, it's something that we've already had to deal with over the last decade. We have 50,000 more older people in Scotland now than we did 10 years ago. And yet, within that context, we have not seen concomitant increase in resources to deal with that. Now, one of the implications that we are seeing with that is that we're having to be much firmer in terms of demand management. So, for example, over the last decade, we've actually seen the number of people, both in care homes and in care at home, decrease in absolute terms against a rising population. And therefore, we would have concerns into the future that unless we address this perceived funding gap, that what will happen is that that will become much stricter, more robust, more aggressive at times in order to ensure that books are balanced at the end of the day. Now, I don't think that that's a vision that we would like to pursue. We want to pursue a vision where we can support people, the entire population in local communities to live rich and fulfilling lives. Our worry is that unless we address the funding question in the longer term, that will become increasingly difficult to realise.
You say in section 21 of your second paper that COSLA is currently working with the Scottish Government and other partners to refine our understanding of the size of the funding gap for health and social care services into the future. I mean, I wonder what that work consists of. And I mean, in fact, how far can you refine it? Because so much will depend on what models of care you're able to establish, really.
Absolutely, and a lot will be based on the assumptions that you use to profile demand into the future. I mean, that group has met a couple of times now, and it's populated by a range of individuals, including health economists, who will allow us to gauge not just projections based crudely on the change to the age structure of the population, but rather to healthy life expectancy and so on, the types of gains that we might be able to see in respect of health and social care, integration and so on. I think probably, while that's an important piece of work, I don't think anybody thinks that at the end of that will make the funding gap disappear. It will still be there. It will still need to be addressed. And the longer that we don't address it, the more difficult it will become actually to fund the types of early intervention and prevention that we want to support.
So, yeah, I mean, that's interesting because, I mean, I think the Cabinet Secretary, when he gave evidence to us, was very much concentrating on integration, which obviously will deliver benefits. But in your report, you also say, you know, emergency admissions, which was the other big issue we dealt with, and delayed discharges are not the only, or even the most important problem, which integration needs to address. And so perhaps the third element that you're flagging up in your last contribution and in your submission is improving healthy life expectancy. But I mean, there's a table in our report, which you may have seen, which suggests that even if every extra year of life meant an extra year of healthy life, you would still have very significant increases in costs. So, I mean, in that sense, do you think no matter how much we manage to do things differently in terms of more people getting continuous care in the community, at home, and all that kind of thing, and more years of healthy life expectancy, I mean, in that sense, do you think there are inevitably going to be very large cost increases no matter how well we do?
Yes. Absolutely. I think that, and you know, I think if you canvass opinion across both local government and the NHS, they would give you the same answer. Is that yes, we will work awfully hard to put all of these interventions in place and deliver a new model of care, an integrated model of care, but ultimately there's a public finance question that needs to be addressed as part of that. And that's not something that's terribly easy either for local government or the NHS to do. Obviously, that's in your territory rather than ours. So.
But I suppose it leads back to the point that Councillor Johnson's made about keeping people healthy. So I suppose that's something we don't know to what extent we can succeed in that. But I suppose, I suppose the other question related to this is that some people have raised, even with our new model of care, and I mean, West Lothian, I know, has been a pioneer in the housing area, certainly, and in other areas in terms of integration. I mean, how much money does that actually save if you have the ideal model, as it were, which there seems to be a lot of consensus around actually for the last decade in terms of what we would like to achieve in terms of continuous care in the community. But actually, I think it was the RCN that said, don't think that's going to save as much money as you think, you know, so potentially how much money can that save?
We don't have sufficient evidence to answer that question. And clearly the difficulty here will be that many of the resources that would be freed up will have to transfer from the acute sector. And that shift in the balance of care from acute to community is still a bit off. Some way to go towards securing that. So it's difficult to answer that. I think there is a consensus that preventative spending and early interventions is the way to go. There is evidence locally that it can save money, but the extent and the quantum it could release will have to be determined by how successful our health and care partnerships are in dealing with things. I mean, we're not giving a message that sorting out delayed discharges is not important. We're not giving a message that reducing unplanned emergency admissions to A&Es is not important. These things are important, and will release resources. But until we actually get engaged in that and actually begin to deliver the release of these resources, it's not easy for us to put a figure on that.
I mean, I won't ask about housing because your housing people aren't here, but I suppose the only general question about housing that would apply to the health and social care people is, I mean, to what extent in the current integration agenda do you think housing is built in? I know it was a criticism of the initial consultation paper that housing wasn't sufficiently covered and involved, but is that, do you feel that's been rectified since then, or do you think there's still an issue about whether housing is sufficiently built into the integration agenda? That's obviously going to be very important for us over the next few months.
I think probably we've reached the right decision in terms of the formal integration of health and social care, which speaks to the NHS services and the council social work services, or adult social work services. But the issue of housing is obviously very important, and I think probably where we see that being taken forward or advanced is in the context of joint strategic commissioning processes. And I think if we can ensure that linkages are made between our assessment of need in the local population and the types of health and care services that we want to support within that context, to the types of housing provision which will support that agenda, I think that's where it crucially needs to come together. And I think, in truth, that's where we are making some progress in terms of bringing the housing community into that discussion. So I don't think it has been formally adopted into health and social care partnerships. There are some funding issues about the reasons why the housing budget couldn't be formally pulled into the health and social care budget. But in terms of the commissioning agenda, I agree. I think it has to be absolutely in there to ensure that there's an integrated approach which goes beyond just health and social care.
Well, speaking for Dundee, I think there's a great deal of joint up working happens between social work and housing. There's just so many people in social housing social work needs that there has to be that level of joint up working. So I'm sure that there's that level of thought going on to the outcomes and future need.
A number of points have been answered, but I just wanted to ask you, Councillor Johnson, you mentioned in your opening statement about some innovation in preventative spending and examples, I think. And I wondered, it seems to me that there's a possibility of changing, or how do we change the culture in the country, which from one of fear of getting old to very, to the whole thing being a very positive experience. I mean, most of us are looking forward to it because we have to. I mean, but it seems to me that there are examples across the country of really, really good practice, and I still haven't got to the root. This happens in lots of areas of different local authorities addressing different problems in different ways, and how we really do share that best practice across Scotland. So much of Scotland is unknown to other bits of Scotland, and I think how we deal with a positive culture to people growing older is something that we could definitely benefit from looking at some of the other bits. And the other question I wanted to ask was about academic research, and I'm always pounding on about this too, but a number of universities do have research students looking at the demographics and how it seems to me again that our academic institutions are quite far removed from COSLA or from local authorities sometimes. And again, there are examples, some of which I've seen, where there is really some interesting work being done. And it does keep, sometimes we can keep older people out of hospital through different activity. Do you know, loneliness makes people ill, and so we know all of these things, and a kind of common sense tells us that too. And I wonder how much of our preventative spend are we proactive about putting into the poorest areas where it's, you know, often needed most. Is that, do we positively discriminate? If we acknowledge that in your report you talk about, you know, being a country worse in Western Europe in terms of longevity and health of our older population.
Well, there's a range of topics you're covering in there. Let me try and answer them, and if I can't run, I'll fill in the gaps, hopefully. In terms of innovation, you're absolutely right. There's lots of good practice currently happening across local authorities, from re-ablement schemes, re-ablement where social policy care staff are actively involved in helping people live healthy and well in their own homes, whether they've come out of hospital or whether they've had a fall or whatever. And it's what it says on the tin. It's allowing them to gain confidence and get back to living independently and well. But then you look at advances in technology, the opportunity to use technology to help support people within their own homes. Lots of innovations going on in that. Telecare systems across Scotland are fairly well known, but there's also the opportunity to create virtual wards with people being cared for at home, vital signs being monitored through technology rather than having to be taken into hospital, etc. So there's all sorts of innovations that are going on, and COSLA, as you would expect, look to share that best practice and look to roll it out and make our fellow councils as aware of that as we possibly can. Now, your other 13 questions, Jean. In terms, Ron, do you want to help me think?
I mean, just to expand on that just now, because it's not just COSLA, of course, that works with our member councils. We have a fairly well-developed improvement infrastructure, and through the improvement service, but also the joint improvement team. And both of those organisations would be able to offer really excellent examples of practice which is shared across the local government and health community, in order that we can begin to learn from each other. And I think you're absolutely right to say that that should continue to be a priority. The other element to your question, which you'd asked about, was the academic interface. And again, that improvement community, probably more than COSLA in truth, would engage with the academic community to ensure that the learning within these institutions can be taken into a practice-based environment. And indeed, there are some institutions which straddle both academia and practice. So IRIS Institute of Research and Social Services, for example, is a practice-based academic exercise which looks to filter that type of information through to local partnerships. So there is quite a well-developed structure. You're right, COSLA probably doesn't interface as much with the academic community as we might, but that, in truth, is because we know that the others are, and our role isn't necessarily to fulfil that interface or to make that interface.
In terms of your comments with regards to do we look to prioritise areas of deprivation, already across local authorities in Scotland there will be work taking place doing exactly that. And certainly from my earlier comments, you'll have heard me say that I think it's fundamental for the emerging health and care community partnerships to have a community health profile that will be the evidence base that they then use to commission services and deliver services to meet the needs identified by such a profile. So I think that would go a long way to helping us to tackle these health inequalities that do exist in a much more effective fashion.
I think earlier, before we came to the meeting, I was speaking to Peter, and he was telling me about the breakfast clubs in his own area, where they targeted a free breakfast club out to the schools where the areas of more multiple deprivation. Obviously looking to how that makes a difference to the children in that area. I know that having been a previously an education convener and going around, some teachers were saying, I would pay for the breakfast myself because at least the child, if they're no hungry, they learn. And if they're needing something to eat and waiting till lunchtime, then it's too late. It's a shift missed at school instead of the learning process goes on. So a lot of good work for the point of view of their local government are clearly looking at how positive discrimination can make a difference to health and inequalities.
And just finally then, do you feel that we're really increasing that? Because it's not new, that people in poor areas have died younger. So, and we're not seeing any shift in that. I mean, you mentioned the two areas of Livingston, Councillor Johnson, as an example, but we all have these examples.
I think what we're arguing is that in times of plenty, the last decade, when resources have been growing substantially, we haven't made inroads that we potentially could have made. So it's going to be more challenging when resources are declining. But by doing things differently, by recognising, and I'm sorry to repeat this, prevention, early intervention, by recognising that that's the way ahead, we think we can begin to more effectively tackle health inequalities.
And the other thing to say, which we've not touched on in detail this morning, is that the reform of the community planning infrastructure, we think, will be important in allowing us to take that agenda forward. So whereas in the past, our statutory organisations and others came to the community planning table essentially with preset agendas, and there was a bit of chat around the table about working together in partnership. What we envisage into the future is that the community planning partners will come to the table with their resources, and in response to local population needs, say, how can we spend these resources more effectively to ensure that we are targeting the types of issues that you raised in terms of deprivation and so on. That was a key feature of the Audit Scotland report on health inequalities, and we think that the reform of community planning, a stronger, more robust community planning partnership, will be empowered to work with communities to deliver the types of improvements that we seek.
Okay, well, thank you very much to colleagues for their questions. I'd like to thank all our witnesses for answering our questions today. The committee agreed on 6th of March to take the next item in private. I therefore now close the public part of the meeting. I'll just allow a 1-minute recess to allow the public and the official report to leave. Thank you.